All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling positivism. We've got a mountain of sources here all about this huge intellectual movement from the 1800s, ready to unpack it all.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating period.
So for our listener who's maybe just dipping their toes into positivism, can we start with the basics? What's the core idea here?
Well, imagine a world where science is king. Positivism puts science front and center as the ultimate source of knowledge. Think of it like using the scientific method to understand everything: society, human behavior, even religion.
Wow. Okay, so not just like test tubes and beakers, but a whole way of seeing the world.
Right. It really captured that 19th century energy in Europe. Tons of scientific discoveries, new technologies popping up everywhere. Positivism kind of rode that wave, promising progress and a better future through science.
Okay, so it wasn't just about science for science's sake. These thinkers genuinely believed positivism could, change the world.
Exactly. They saw it as the key to solving social problems, understanding human nature, even building better societies.
But didn't this focus on, cold, hard facts and data spark some pushback? I mean, can we really reduce everything to just numbers and measurements?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't without its critics. One of the big criticisms was that it was too reductionist. Can we truly capture the richness of human experience with just data points?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's more to the human story than just what we can measure, right?
Exactly. And some worried about determinism, the idea that if everything's governed by scientific laws, does that leave any room for free will? Are we all just cogs in a giant machine?
Ooh, big questions. Which leads us perfectly to the man who really put positivism on the map, Auguste Comte, often called the godfather of the movement. What was his deal?
Comte was all about understanding how human thinking evolves. He had this idea called the law of three stages. He said first we're in the theological stage, where we explain everything through gods and spirits.
Right, like the volcano erupted because the gods are angry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then comes the metaphysical stage, where we shift to more abstract concepts like reason or nature.
Okay, so trading in the gods for big philosophical ideas.
Yeah. But the ultimate goal, according to Comte, was the positive stage, where we finally embrace science as the way to understand the world.
It's like humanity graduating from superstition to evidence-based thinking.
That's a great way to put it. But then Comte did something really unexpected. He tried to create a whole religion of humanity based on, guess what? Science.
Whoa, hold on. A religion of science.
Yeah.
That's a twist I didn't see coming.
It sounds strange, right? But Comte believed that even with scientific progress, people still needed a sense of shared values, purpose, ritual. So he envisioned this system where science wasn't just about facts, but also formed the basis for ethics and social unity.
It almost feels like he was trying to bridge that gap between science and spirituality.
Yeah.
To find meaning in the facts,
I think you're right. He was ahead of his time in that sense, recognizing that science alone might not fulfill all of humanity's needs.
Yeah. Which is a conversation we're still having today, right? The role of science, ethics, technology, it's all connected. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another big name in positivism, John Stuart Mill. He brought a bit of a different flavor to the movement, didn't he?
He did. Mill is super interesting because he was a champion of individual liberty and this idea called utilitarianism, but he was also deeply influenced by positivism.
So it's not just about cold, hard data with Mill. There's a bit more heart in there.
Exactly. Mill was all about maximizing happiness, but not just any kind of happiness. He believed some pleasures were higher, more worthwhile than others. Like reading a good book is a better pleasure than, say, eating a whole bag of candy.
So it's not just feeling good, but living a good life like that.
And importantly, he emphasized that it wasn't just about your happiness. Utilitarianism is about maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people. That societal well-being piece was central to his thinking.
Okay, so even though he was a positivist, emphasizing reason and evidence, he was also concerned with ethics and the well-being of society.
Absolutely. He really grappled with how to create a better world, not just understand it. And that led him to be a fierce defender of free speech, even for unpopular opinions. He believed that silencing dissent actually hinders progress.
That's such a relevant idea, even now when we see so much polarization and people trying to shut down dissenting voices. It makes you wonder, are we really living up to Mill's vision of open discourse?
It's a question worth asking, especially in today's world where algorithms and echo chambers can sometimes make it hard to encounter diverse perspectives.
Food for thought, for sure. But we can't talk about positivism without mentioning the guy who took those ideas in a pretty bold and maybe controversial direction, Herbert Spencer.
Spencer's the one who took Darwin's theory of evolution and applied it to Dot society.
Right, so survival of the fittest. But for, like, entire cultures and nations.
You got it. He coined that phrase, survival of the fittest, and believed that just like in nature, the strongest, most adaptable societies would thrive, while others would, well, fade away.
That sounds like it could be easily misinterpreted or even used to justify some pretty awful things.
And it was, unfortunately. His ideas, often called social Darwinism, were used to support colonialism, racism, eugenics. It's a reminder that even brilliant minds can have blind spots, and we always have to be critical of ideas that can be used to justify harm.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that the impact of ideas can go far beyond the intentions of the thinker. Speaking of big impacts, we can't leave out the man himself, Charles Darwin. His theory of evolution really shook things up.
It was revolutionary. Imagine sailing around the world on the HMS Beagle, collecting specimens, observing nature for years. Talk about
It's
dedication.
like something out of an adventure novel.
His big breakthrough was understanding natural selection, how individuals within a species have slight variations in their traits, and those variations that are better fitted to the environment are more likely to survive and pass those traits on.
And that, over vast stretches of time, leads to new species evolving.
You got it. It seems so obvious now, but back then it completely changed how people understood the world. Imagine the courage it took to publish those findings, especially in a world dominated by religious explanations of creation.
It was like a seismic shift, changing the course of biology forever.
Totally. Darwin's work is still the bedrock of biology today. But here's the thing. Positivism wasn't just an English phenomenon. These ideas were spreading all over Europe.
Okay, let's expand our map a bit. What were some of the key figures who were championing positivism in other parts of Europe?
Well, in Italy, we have Roberto Ardigo. He actually started as a priest. Can you believe it?
Wow, talk about a career change. What led him to positivism?
It seems he became fascinated by the power of science and reason, eventually leaving the priesthood to become a leading figure in Italian positivism, especially in psychology and education. Ardigo really stressed the importance of observation and experience in understanding the human mind.
So instead of relying on philosophical speculation about how the mind works, he wanted to study it through observation and experimentation. A very positivist approach.
Right. And he even argued for a more hands-on approach to education, where students would learn by doing rather than just memorizing facts. It's fascinating to think about how classrooms might look different if his ideas had fully taken hold.
That's an interesting thought. It makes me wonder if our modern education systems have found the right balance between hands-on learning and more traditional methods. But for now, let's hop over the Alps to France, where another major positivist figure was making waves.
In France, we have to talk about Pierre-Simon Laplace. This guy was a genius, especially when it came to math and astronomy. I mean, this was a time before computers, and he was making incredible discoveries about the solar system, doing all these complex calculations by hand.
I could barely balance my checkbook without a calculator. So what was his connection to positivism?
Well, Laplace was a big believer in the power of reason and scientific laws to explain the universe. He was a strong advocate for determinism, the idea that the universe operates like a giant clock with everything predetermined. He believed that if we knew all the starting conditions, we could theoretically predict every single event that would ever happen.
Wow. That's a bold claim. It suggests that there's no such thing as chance or free will, that everything is governed by these unbreakable laws. Kind of makes you feel like a tiny cog in this grand cosmic machine, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that's what made Laplace's views so fascinating and controversial. If everything is preordained, what does that mean for our choices, for morality, for the feeling that we have any control over our lives? These are questions that have haunted philosophers for centuries.
And they're questions that still resonate with us today, especially as we grapple with advances in fields like genetics and artificial intelligence, which seem to challenge our ideas about free will and determinism.
It's a lot to think about. And it reminds us that positivism wasn't just about scientific discoveries. It also sparked these profound philosophical debates about the nature of reality and the human experience. Debates that we're still having today in many ways.
It seems like the more we learn about the world through science, the more we're forced to confront these big questions about what it means to be human. But that's a conversation for another time. For now, I think it's time to take a break and let our listeners process all this incredible information. Phew. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from Kanti's Religion of Humanity to Mill's fight for individual liberty, and even Spencer's controversial take on social evolution.
It's a whirlwind tour of some seriously big ideas. And as we've seen, positivism wasn't just some abstract philosophy. It had a real impact, shaping how people thought about science, society, and even human nature.
But like we were just talking about, it also had its limitations, right? That whole reductionist thing, trying to boil down the human experience to just cold, hard data.
Yeah.
I feel like something's missing there.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, can we really quantify things like love, beauty, or the feeling of awe when you look up at the stars? Positivism, for all its strengths, might have missed some of that richness.
It's like, can we really capture the full symphony of human experience if we're only listening for specific notes?
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to consider different ways of knowing. Positivism was a hugely influential movement, but it wasn't the be-all and end-all of intellectual thought.
So it's not about saying positivism was wrong, but more about recognizing it as one piece of a larger puzzle.
I like that. It's like having a toolbox. You wouldn't use a hammer for every job. Right? You need a saw, a screwdriver, a wrench, different tools for different tasks.
And in the same way, we need different intellectual tools to understand the world. Positivism gave us some powerful ones, but it's not the whole toolbox.
Exactly. And it's through studying history, like we're doing now, that we can start to see these different tools, how they were used, and how they've shaped the world we live in. Which brings us back to a question we've been dancing around.
Knowing everything we know now about the world and, well, human nature, does that positivist dream of a purely scientific society where reason and evidence reign supreme even seem possible, or desirable for that matter?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? On the one hand, science has undeniably made our lives better in countless ways. Think about medicine, technology, our understanding of the universe. It's hard to imagine our world without the advancements that science has made possible.
No arguments there.
Yeah.
But we've also seen how scientific knowledge can be misused, right? And a solely technocratic approach to society. Well, it might not leave much room for things like ethics, compassion, art, spirituality.
Right. It's like that saying, just because we can doesn't mean we should. We need to be mindful of the potential consequences of our actions, even when those actions are driven by scientific progress.
So maybe it's not about pitting science against humanity. It's about finding a way to integrate them, to use our scientific knowledge wisely, ethically, humanely.
Couldn't agree more. We need both. The rigor of science and the wisdom to use it well. And that's where fields like philosophy, ethics, the arts, they all become essential.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that synergy between different ways of knowing. So how do we wrap all this up for our listener who's been on this deep dive with us? What's the takeaway message here?
I'd say the big takeaway is the importance of balance. Positivism's emphasis on reason and evidence remains incredibly valuable, but we also need to acknowledge that science doesn't have all the answers.
And that sometimes the most important questions, the ones about meaning and purpose and values, those might not be answerable in a lab.
You got it. We need to nurture our critical thinking skills, question our assumptions, be open to different perspectives, and always be willing to learn and adapt.
Because the world is complex, right? And no single ideology, no matter how well-intentioned, can capture that complexity in its entirety.
Well said. And that's why studying history, philosophy, all these different ways of thinking is so vital. It helps us understand how we got here, what worked, what didn't, and hopefully how to build a better future.
And it's not just about the past, right? Studying history can help us make sense of what's happening right now. Which brings me to a final question, something to really get our listeners thinking.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
So, if positivism emerged during a period of huge scientific and technological advancements in the 19th century, what kind of philosophy might emerge from our era? I mean, think about it. We're living in a time of digital technologies, globalization, information overload. What new ways of thinking are taking root right now?
That's a fascinating question to ponder. Who knows, maybe we're seeing the seeds of entirely new philosophies that will shape how we understand knowledge, truth, and what it means to be human in this digital age.
It's exciting to think about, and a little bit daunting too. But as history shows us, it's often during these periods of rapid change and intellectual ferment that the most profound shifts in human understanding occur.
Absolutely. And maybe someone listening to this right now grappling with these ideas will be the next Comte or Mill, the next visionary who helps us see the world in a whole new light.
So to our listener, I say this. Keep those minds curious, those questions coming, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. We're living in extraordinary times, and who knows what incredible ideas are just waiting to be discovered.
That's the spirit. The world of knowledge is vast and constantly evolving, so keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep that intellectual spark alive.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into positivism. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, ready to unpack even more big ideas and explore the history of thought. Until then, happy exploring. So where do we go from here? We've spent all this time with these big thinkers, these positivist pioneers. What's the lasting impact? What's their legacy?
Well, it's complicated, right? Positivism, for all its flaws, really did push us forward. It emphasized reason, observation, evidence. It helped shape modern science, influenced how we approach knowledge, even how we structure societies.
But we've also seen the downsides. That tendency towards reductionism, that sometimes cold and calculated view of the world. Can we really boil down human experience to just numbers and data points?
I think that's where the critiques come in, right? Positivism might have oversimplified things a bit, tried to fit the messiness of human life into a neat scientific box.
It makes you wonder, is there a way to hold on to the best parts of positivism, that rigor, that emphasis on evidence, without losing sight of what makes us human? The emotions, the creativity, the things that can't be measured in a lab.
I think that's the challenge, isn't it, finding that balance? Because we need both.
Yeah.
The power of science and the wisdom to use it well. And that's where things like ethics, philosophy, the arts, they all come into play.
So for our listener who's been on this deep dive with us, what's the key takeaway here? What can we learn from both the triumphs and the pitfalls of positivism?
That's a good question. I think the biggest lesson is the importance of nuance. We need to be careful about embracing any one ideology too rigidly, even one as influential as positivism.
Because there's always more to the story, right?
Yeah.
Always more to learn, more to question.
Absolutely. We need to stay curious, be willing to challenge our own assumptions, consider different perspectives. The world is complex, and we need a diverse set of tools to understand it.
And maybe that's the real legacy of positivism. Not just the specific ideas, but that push to keep asking questions, to keep searching for answers, even if those answers sometimes lead to more questions.
It's that intellectual curiosity that keeps us moving forward, keeps us evolving. And, that's what makes studying these intellectual movements so fascinating. We get to see how these ideas played out, how they shaped the world, and what we can learn from them.
And it's not just about the past, right? These ideas, these debates, they're still relevant today.
Which brings me to a final question, something to really get our listeners thinking as we wrap up this deep dive. Ready?
Hit me with it. So if positivism emerged during a time of massive scientific and technological advancement in the 19th century, what kind of philosophies might emerge from our current era? I mean, think about all the changes happening right now. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, climate change, this constant flow of information. It feels like we're on the cusp of something big.
That's a great question. And it's hard to say for sure what the future holds, but you're right, there's this feeling of being on the edge of something new. And just like those positivist thinkers were grappling with the big questions of their time, we're facing our own set of challenges and opportunities.
It's almost like we're living through a new intellectual revolution, right? And just like those 19th century thinkers, we have to figure out how to navigate this new landscape. What does it mean to be human in a world of artificial intelligence? How do we balance technological progress with ethical considerations? What are the new ways of thinking that will help us make sense of this rapidly changing world?
Those are the big questions we need to be asking. And maybe, just maybe, someone listening to this right now will be the one to come up with those new ideas, those new philosophies that help us navigate this uncharted territory.
It's an exciting thought, isn't it? The future is full of possibilities.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of intellectual exploration. It's an ongoing journey. So to our listener, I say this: keep those minds curious, stay engaged with the big questions, and never stop exploring the world of ideas. Who knows what amazing discoveries you might make?
Couldn't agree more. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep that intellectual spark alive.
And that wraps up our deep dive into positivism. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the history of ideas. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, happy exploring.